So these talks are always about the same topic, really. And if I didn't state that up front, as we progress through the talk and move on to a whole lot of different subtopics, we could easily get lost. Our thinking can get lost in thinking it is about the subtopic. And the subtopics are only there because they support the primary topic. And so whenever we're thinking about a subtopic that I might start talking about, we should always remind ourselves or ask ourselves, how does this relate to the primary topic? And the primary topic of the talks, and I suggest the primary topic of anyone seeking, is peace of mind, unbroken peace of mind in daily living. And according to this framework of concepts, which you could call a teaching, unbroken peace of mind is the form in which human happiness is available. So if I say or describe the talks about one thing, and that one thing is peace of mind in daily living, unbroken peace of mind in daily living, then another way that we can label it, or label what the talks are about, is happiness, human happiness. Now let's be very clear that human happiness as defined, as described in this context, is happiness through peace of mind, because I've suggested that the talks are about continuous unbroken peace of mind, and it turns out that when we find ourselves with this continuous unbroken peace of mind, we realize, this is human happiness. This is what it is to be happy, as opposed to feeling joyful, for example, or as opposed to never getting angry, or as opposed to experiencing pleasure of different sorts, as opposed to happiness through outcomes, happiness through circumstance. Circumstance is going to be pleasure or pain, and human thinking has, because the circumstance is what seems to be most evident to us, we've assumed that it's happiness through pleasure that is available. So essentially we've mistaken our happiness for pleasure, and so then we're on a mission to get more and more pleasure because we think that is synonymous with happiness. And so for as long as that's the case, then we're going to be heading in the wrong direction. We're going to be seeking for something that isn't really available. Why do I say happiness through pleasure isn't available? Because pleasure is intermittent. Pleasure is going to fade away. Pleasure is going to be replaced by pain from time to time. And so if our happiness is dependent on pleasure, 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 it really isn't available. So peace of mind, why is it that peace of mind is a happiness that is available? And the reason is because peace of mind is something that exists on the layer we can call attitude to circumstance. And so that means that the circumstance can be changing. Changing circumstance is the nature of the flow of life. So there's no option for that to change from being sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain to always pleasure, 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 pleasure. However, our attitude to the circumstance is something entirely different. Our attitude to the circumstance is something that can remain constant, even when the circumstance, the outcomes, the pleasure and pain, all of those three things, circumstance, outcomes, pleasure and pain, they're all synonymous with each other, interchangeable words. Even when they are changing, our attitude towards the circumstance can be constant. And it's on the level of our attitude that suffering exists. And suffering is what disturbs peace of mind. So, essentially, the human unhappiness that exists is not because of pain in our life, not because of circumstance that isn't in line with our preferences, i.e. painful circumstance. It exists because our attitude that has been put in place from a very young age towards pleasure and pain has been one of involvement, one of identification, one of feeling defined on a level of self based on circumstance. So that is the attitude that creates an uncomfortableness, a feeling of uncomfortableness. That is, when we look at it, what human unhappiness is. So our unhappiness is also to be found on that layer of attitude, and it is an attitude towards circumstance. And happiness comes in when the attitude that creates suffering changes. So when we look at this attitude, we say, what is the attitude? Because this is interesting. If we say it's all about your attitude to the flow of life, or if we just abbreviate it and say it's all about happiness is about your attitude, there are all sorts of different attitudes. We could have an attitude of positivity, an attitude of dedication, an attitude of consistency. Those aren't the attitudes. I'm not saying it's about attitude of positive thinking, for example, or attitude of dedicating. So when we ask, okay, so what is the attitude that creates suffering? That's when we find that it's the attitude of personal doership and the attitude of attachment to outcomes. That's the area within the layer of attitude towards circumstance that creates human suffering or human happiness. So that's very important. Now, all of these words are essentially pointers, descriptions. So if you listen to them as descriptions, which means describing objects, describing dynamics, describing what is. Now, that's not to say that it is a perfect description of what is, because what is can be seen from many different angles in relation to many different topics. But in relation to this topic of human happiness, this is one set of descriptions of the components that are important for us to become more familiar with. And so the point of the talk is for whoever's listening to it, hopefully, to be guided for attention, for the intellect, for awareness, to become more focused or more aware of these dynamics. And as we start to investigate the dynamics that are being described, we can start to appreciate things that maybe hadn't been realized before or appreciated before. So the very description or use of the phrase, the flow of life, might hopefully get us to ask, what does the flow of life mean? And in this context, it means the unfolding circumstance, the way things turn out throughout the day is what is being referred to as the flow of life. And it's described, the flow of life is either pleasure or pain. The flow of life is circumstance. The flow of life is outcomes, because in each moment the circumstance is essentially an outcome relative to what was there before. So speaking in this moment is an outcome. And then that outcome finishes, and the next outcome, which might be the moving of the glass, happens. So circumstance, flow of life, outcomes, pleasure and pain, because an outcome is either preferable or not preferable, pleasurable or painful. So those are all descriptions that hopefully allow the intellect to get an idea of what is being talked about. And the clearer the descriptions, the more thought out, the more practical, the more accurate, the more the various descriptions connect with each other and create a bigger picture, a big overall framework, the more useful they probably are. So what was all that? Essentially, it's saying the talks are about happiness. Happiness turns out to be continuous, unbroken peace of mind, and not happiness through outcomes. So the happiness through outcomes that we're seeking, the teaching says actually that's not available. If you see yourself seeking happiness in outcomes, maybe it will dawn on you, oh, I am seeking happiness through outcomes, with the obvious ingrained belief that that is available. And the teaching is saying, redirect your thinking such that it starts to realize that seeking happiness in outcomes is actually part of our suffering. Seeking out happiness in outcomes is part of a reinforcing of a sense of who we are that is quite superficial and covers up a deeper sense of who we are, a deeper connection to a more fundamental part of the human being. And our happiness, our true contentment, stems from our very nature, stems from us connecting with that part of ourself that is obscured when our thinking is looking outward and reinforcing a sense of self that is not what we truly are. And so as we become aware of these essentially errors, misunderstanding, ignorance is how various teachings have phrased it. Now let me make it clear, it's not ignorance, misunderstanding, errors created by someone that should know better. It's not a personal mistake, it's a error that life has forced us to make based on the way we develop. And we don't control the way that we develop. It sort of happens to us. And that way that we develop is essentially because of the conditioning that the body-mind organism receives moment after moment after moment. And that conditioning can be the more obvious conditioning from parents, from society, from teachers, from religion, and the conditioning from just exposure to and from the senses. So everything is coming into the system, including the feedback we get from the senses, and that creates the conditioned or the conditioning of the body. And this teaching, any teaching, is simply new conditioning. New conditioning that can adjust our up-to-date conditioning, and as a result of adjusting our up-to-date conditioning, allow us to then function differently. Allow us to experience life differently because we're essentially changed. So the misunderstanding gets put in place by life through the form of new conditioning coming in that conditions us in a way where we've made essentially an error, where we have come to know ourselves in a way that is fairly superficial and prevents a deeper knowing of ourselves. And then life, through such things as teaching and through experience that allows us to form conclusions about how we have related to life, then life allows for new conditioning to set in that has the potential to redirect us onto a different path. And that is the move from misunderstanding to understanding. And it's not really an understanding of knowledge where we have lots of new knowledge about things, lots of new information. It's really just a correcting of the previous misinformation. So it's essentially a rubbing out, an erasing of the misinformation. It's sort of like going into the computer system and deleting certain files. And it's not so much about reinserting new files. It's more about deleting files that are causing misfires on the level of our sense of self. When those files get deleted, then we find that the experience becomes more spacious, more quiet, less uncomfortable, what we could call more peaceful. Not because we've started doing a whole lot of new functioning, but rather because a whole lot of noise, uncomfortable noise, has fallen away because the certain beliefs that noise was stemming from have been erased. So that concept is a concept that suggests, that's saying that our peace of mind is actually from becoming more quiet. It's also saying that it's not something you can just choose to do, because it's suggesting that both the noise and the erasing of the noise is a result of life delivering whatever it delivers, and we're not in control of what life delivers, and we're not in control of how what life delivers affects and changes us. So what that notion is suggesting is that we're not the doers, and life has always just been happening. And so even when we thought we were the doers, when this fact may have been underappreciated, that life has formed us to feel, to think, to act a very particular way, and that is automatic. When that understanding isn't there, and we feel like we are the doer, that doesn't mean there is a doer. It just means that the non-doing, meaning the way that the body-mind organism that has been designed by life to function a particular way, is functioning in a way that doesn't appreciate that it is a programmed instrument, and therefore feels and thinks that it is a separate, independent, autonomous entity that is responsible due to its own independence and its own volition. Meaning the attitude it has towards how things happen, the speaking, the acting, its attitude is, I am uninfluenced by anything, and I make a decision in the moment based on my own free will that is entirely generated within my system, that is independent and uninfluenced from anything outside. Well, that's probably why they came up with the word ignorance or misunderstanding in a lot of the traditions, spiritual teaching traditions, because when you look at that, it is an assessment of life, it is an attitude towards everything that happens through myself or the other that is completely misguided. It is the conclusion based on how experience feels, that I am a separate, uninfluenced entity that is its own agent, has free will. And when we look at it more clearly, we see, oh, I am an entity that didn't exist at some point, and then a sperm and an egg came together and created a blueprint, an amazing blueprint that develops into essentially a biological instrument. And that biological instrument is dictated by forces and factors outside of the making of that entity, but rather the entity is made. So the entity is a result. It isn't the controller. It is the result of the sperm and the egg coming together and then them developing into you could say predetermined, because the blueprint comes into existence at the point of conception, and then the body mind organism develops. And that developing hardware or machinery is then influenced moment after moment after moment throughout the formative years and beyond, up to the point of death. And that influence from society puts in place our morals, our values, our intellect, and that obviously is in conjunction with our biological capacities. So our intellect, if we have certain biological restrictions, can only be what it is. And someone else with a different biological structure, maybe with the same general conditioning, can have a very different intellect, because the genes are different. So essentially who we are in each moment is a result of our genes and up-to-date conditioning, and those are the only two factors that determine our functioning on a biological and a psychological level. And those two factors, genes and up-to-date conditioning, completely out of our control. And so when we look at that, we go, I can't be an independent agent making decisions in a bubble, completely isolated. That's the opposite of how we develop. We grow up, we develop in not a bubble, but in direct connection with everything that is happening in the outside world on a moment-to-moment basis. Now, our thinking just hasn't really been focused to think about this and to conclude what this really means. And what it means in a nutshell is that if someone is a murderer, it's saying that they are a murderer because of their genes and up-to-date conditioning. Now, that's not excusing a murderer. It's not saying that their actions are okay or pleasant. It's just describing the reasons why that happens. So it's not saying that there shouldn't be consequences for someone's actions. There can still be consequences even if you're not the doer, even if you have been essentially designed by life to function a certain way. Life in its greater whole can impose consequences to maybe improve the situation. But attitudinally, if we can understand that this is what's going on, then the guilt and the blame towards ourselves and towards others for what happens can be diminished, because the guilt and blame and pride is the attitude towards those actions that are beneficial as opposed to those actions that are deliver bad results. So the guilt towards our actions that deliver not so great results, the pride towards our actions that deliver good results, the blame towards the actions of the others that hurt us, all of that is based on the attitude of personal doership. And if that attitude of personal doership starts getting interfered with, where we realize, oh, this is a happening, life is a happening, the speaking, the actions, the good actions, the bad actions, or those actions that deliver positive results or painful results relative to our preferences, are all inevitable, are all part of a bigger movement, and that there isn't a separate individual that is disconnected or separated from life. There never has been and there never will be. So a concept, a way of coming to see life guided by this concept that I'm going to put forward, that was extremely imperative in the process that I went through, and in fact a process that a lot of people go through, is the notion that everything that happens is predetermined. Everything that happens is according to God's will, or according to God, according to creation. That notion that everything is predetermined, that the whole of time, from the beginning of time to the end of time, has happened in an instant, and is then being experienced as if it is a linear unfolding. That's how we experience it. But the notion is that it all happened in an instant. The whole of time, the 13.8 billion apparent years that have apparently happened, and anything before or after that, all came into existence in an instant. A bit like a movie that, as Ramesh used to say, the movie is already in the can. So if you had a DVD or a digital recording of the movie, the beginning, the middle, and the end exists. And the movie can be experienced as a progression. It can be experienced as if life is happening spontaneously, but in fact, it's all in the can. And to further demonstrate what I mean by this, everything is predetermined, it is implying that a leaf will fall off a tree at exactly the point that it is destined to fall off the tree, and it will follow the path from the tree branch down to the ground that is destined, meaning that every twist of the leaf, every gust of wind, and where it starts, where it finishes, and everywhere in between is exactly where the creation has created the leaf to be. And that same notion applies to everything that exists within the manifestation, everything that exists within life, or the experience of life, which includes the speaking of you and me and everyone else, the breathing, the twitches, the feelings, the circumstance. The circumstance in a broader sense, or life in a broader sense, includes circumstance and the biological experiences, which are really, or the biological reactions, which are part of the circumstance, we would say. So the fact that my hands are moving is part of circumstance. It's part of the biological movements. And life overall includes the attitudinal, so certain feelings that we wouldn't call biological, which in this teaching framework are the psychological reactions, that are those reactions that are based on our attitude to the flow of life, based on the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcomes. So all of that, nothing is outside of the bubble of predetermination. Nothing is outside of the bubble of the creation. It's unfolding, life is unfolding exactly as it's destined to unfold, including these words, including your reaction to these words. On any level, whether it's a thought, whether it's a feeling, whether it's a shifting of your body in the seat, all of that is happening because it is part of the creation. So Ramana, one of his fundamental statements, I guess you could say, was this. He says, everything in the manifestation, everything in the universe happens according to the great ordainer. The body functions according to its design and its karma. Also, obviously, according to the great ordainer. But specifically, it's being defined that on a mechanistic level, it is according to its design, but that design put in place by the great ordainer. And therefore, the movements according to the design are part of what is predetermined, and the design of the body, what is predetermined. So I'll start again. Everything that happens in the universe happens according to the great ordainer. The body functions according to its design and its karma. It then goes on to state that if something is destined to happen, no matter what force in the universe tries to make it not happen, it will still happen. Whatever is destined not to happen, no matter what force in the universe tries to make it happen, it will still not happen. Understanding this means there is not much to talk about. So what that last sentence is saying is, when we understand this, there is not much to talk about, is referring to at least one significant explanation of what it's referring to, or interpretation of what it's referring to, is the continuous judgment and questioning and doubt that we have about all of the things in life. Why? Why did this happen? That shouldn't have happened. This should happen. That's the talk. That's when we don't understand that life is happening exactly as it is destined to happen. Then there is a lot to comment on. When the understanding changes, the commentary no longer makes sense. The why is answered by because. The why doesn't arise when it is known that whatever happens, or when whatever happens is seen with the eyes that say that is part of what was destined to happen. Why was a baby born handicapped? Not making it good. I'm not saying, oh, it's all fine now that because we know that it's part of what was destined. It doesn't turn something that is or was painful into pleasure. No, it's still painful, but it's understood to be part of what is destined to happen, part of the creation, part of how life had to be, part of the inevitability of life. This shouldn't have happened that way. You should have done this. I should have done that. Looking back on the past with regret, all of that falls away, because the basis on which all of that commentary, all of that regret, all of that blame happens is based on the idea it should have and it could have been different. It's based on seeing myself and the other as the ordainers. So when we see ourselves as the ordainers, which in this teaching means the doers, then we say, oh, well, I should have known better, I should have done better. I should have used my free will to function differently in the moment. When we understand that the great ordainer has put in place our design and has put in place the action and the outcome, then the commentary about what happened in the past falls away, because everything that happened in the past is seen with an underlying principle that is consistent. So there is a lowest common denominator of everything that happened in the past, and that is, it happened exactly the way it was destined to happen according to God's will. And the same applies to the attitude, the chatter, the talk about the future. Everything in the future will happen exactly the way it is destined to happen. Now remember, the talks are about happiness in daily living. Happiness in daily living turns out to be happiness through peace of mind. Peace of mind turns out to be the absence, the falling away of noise, the falling away of the uncomfortable suffering. And when we look at it, the uncomfortable suffering exists in the form of guilt, blame, pride, worry and expectation. Worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcomes. And all of those mental movements are based on our attitude to the past, the present, or the future, all of which are based on the assumption, I am the ordainer. That's the guilt and the pride. I am the ordainer. The blame is towards the other, saying you were the ordainer. The worry and anxiety is saying, well, I am dependent on outcomes and I need to worry about me functioning well enough because I'm the ordainer. And expectation is the imagining how we want life to turn out, thinking that me and the other can create it that way because we think we're the ordainers. And so this peace of mind, this happiness comes when our attitude towards life starts being interfered with in a way where the old way of thinking gets cut off quicker and quicker and quicker than it used to. At some point, there was no capacity for it to get cut off because life was seen as if we are the ordainers in a way where no information that challenges that has entered the system. So as something different enters the system, and as we think about it, as we investigate it for ourselves based on our own experience, not just believe it, because to believe it is not powerful enough. We need to know it. We need to see why that makes so much sense. We need to get first-hand information that supports that. So there are two ways of looking at it. One is you can look at it on a causal, materialistic way and forget about God's will everything has been put in place as a block, and just see that God, life, delivers new conditioning in each moment and has put in place the genes and therefore creates us according to these materialistic factors, the genes and up-to-date conditioning, and that we function obviously according to that design. We humans can't breathe underwater, let's say, because we don't have the design. and fish can't breathe on land because they don't have the design. And the reason that this belief of doership gets put in place is because the conditioning that is affecting us so deeply affects us in a way that doesn't make us recognize or doesn't feel like we're being affected. So what we end up with is the experience of the genes and up-to-date conditioning. So what we see is a thought arising, or we experience having a thought, and we experience having a feeling, and that thought and that feeling arises from what we know ourselves as, the body, and there isn't an appreciation that the body has been shaped by life, because it doesn't feel like it's being shaped by life. It feels like, because all we actually get to really experience is the speaking and it feels like I am the producer, rather than I am a machine shaped by life to produce exactly what life has shaped me to produce. If we start investigating it and thinking about it, contemplating it, looking at our thoughts and seeing how completely influenced they are by our life up to this point in time, which includes the beliefs of our parents that we may be very much in line with, or we may have very different beliefs to our parents, and we can, when we look at it, we might say, oh, I have different beliefs because I was exposed to the beliefs of my parents that at some point made me say, I don't agree with that, and I'm going to raise my children differently, or I'm going to engage in work differently. I'm going to live life differently to how my parents have lived life. Or we might find ourselves living life very much like our parents. And in both cases, it is a result of whatever our up-to-date conditioning and our genetics are. So if we investigate this, it then becomes obvious. The other way of, and so if we investigate it based on our own experience, when we see a thought arise and we realize this is a thought that society has essentially conditioned me to think, or life has conditioned me to think, if it's a thought that is different to the mainstream, we'll realize, I think differently to the mainstream because life inspired me to look outside the box, whereas it hasn't inspired some other people to look outside the box. So that, when we investigate it for ourselves, it becomes something known, deeply appreciated, and then we start to see it everywhere, like really see it, where it's not just a concept anymore. It has shifted from being a conceptual understanding to something that we see moment after moment after moment. You might see that this talk is new conditioning that then gets you to think. Tomorrow you might have a 15-minute contemplation about God's will, and then the realization might happen, that thinking, which I look at as my doing, is actually a consequence of new conditioning that has become part of my up-to-date conditioning that life delivered, in this case through a talk that I listened to yesterday. And as we see this more and more and more, at some point we have the realization, I simply cannot be the doer. Which means I simply am not the great ordainer. If the thought of the great ordainer arises tomorrow, where you say, I simply cannot be the great ordainer, or everything happens according to the great ordainer, then the realization might be, this thought is not an independent thought from an independent, separate being disconnected from life, but rather it is a result of up-to-date conditioning that was influenced by new conditioning delivered through a talk I listened to yesterday. And I simply cannot be the doer. This principle applies not only to that thought that you recognize as being linked to previous conditioning, it applies to every single thought and feeling you had and have, whether you recognize that it is influenced by genes or up-to-date conditioning or not. Because the concept in this teaching is everything is a result of our genes and up-to-date conditioning, whether you realize it or not. This understanding, if it goes deeply, can uproot and remove the burden of guilt and blame and pride and worry and expectation that we've been carrying around for our whole life. It will be known, not as a concept, but in the absence of the doubt, in the absence of the embarrassment, of the shame, of the blame, we will feel that we are living life knowing we are being lived, knowing we are an expression of Source. That means that we essentially live life connected to Source. When there is a direct knowing, because the obscuring belief has fallen away, when there is a direct knowing that the speaking is happening according to Source, that this body-mind organism is being lived, and all other body-mind organisms, even when a body-mind organism is not aware of their connection to Source, they're still being lived. So we can say that happiness is continuous unbroken peace of mind, and continuous unbroken peace of mind is a consequence of continuous and unbroken connection to Source. This means that it's understood that the total amount of pleasure and pain that I am destined to experience in life has already been determined, and that whatever pain or pleasure I receive in life through my actions or the actions of the other or happenings of nature is simply the mechanism through which my destiny is being delivered. Now, from this perspective, the other stops being a rival, an enemy, a competitor. The other stops being someone that I have to be jealous of or hate. But rather the other is seen as an instrument, just like I am, an instrument through which life is happening. The best example that I can give in practical terms was a time when my house was leased out and I had tenants in the house who you could describe as rogue tenants in the end. They didn't pay their rent. They didn't leave when they were meant to leave. They left the house in a big mess when they did leave. They didn't communicate honestly in the interim. And essentially created pain relative to how things were supposed to turn out. Supposed to relative to the contractual agreement. So we'll talk about how we should see the contractual agreement, because if we keep in mind that is the contractual agreement, so that is how it is supposed to turn out, then that is expectation to outcome. And if we have an expectation to outcome, when it turns out the way it is destined to turn out, we're going to have a dissonance, we're going to have a resistance between the two, between our expectation and the actuality. So it's essentially their actions were painful relative to my preference. So we could say it would have been much more my preference to receive the rental income I was due. It would be much more my preference to not have had to employ someone to clean up and go through legal proceedings to get them out of the house, etc., etc. But if it's seen that that was my destiny, that was the story of life, my story of life, unfolding exactly as it was destined to unfold, and the tenants were simply instruments of life that were part of the story for me to receive exactly the amount of pleasure and pain in that period that I was meant to receive. And so then the attitude to the tenants is not one of hatred and animosity and resentment, but rather the attitude is one of seeing one's destiny unfolding and seeing the other as the instrument through which that destiny unfolds. Now, that doesn't prevent us from still doing certain things if it feels appropriate, like trying to recover the money through a legal process. However, when we engage in that, hopefully our attitudes will see that, oh, I'm engaging in this because it's what's destined, and the outcome is destined and not in my control. And so our attitude is, oh, I'm engaging in a legal proceeding, however, there won't be an attachment to outcome, knowing that the outcome could be anything. Understanding that the outcome of the legal procedure might even put you in a worse situation. It may create a situation where they become hostile. It may create a situation that costs you money and then you don't get awarded in favor of, or you get awarded in favor of and yet you can't recover the money from the people. So the outcome is not in your control. And whatever the outcome, if seen as destiny unfolding, is much more easily accepted. Especially if that the falling away of the old attitude has revealed a space within our experience, or what we could call a connection to consciousness, to source, where we feel content regardless of what is happening in the circumstance. And so when that happens, we have first-hand experience that our happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. We have direct experience that our happiness is already who we are, and that it's the thinking mind that drags us out of connection to self, a self that is complete even while circumstance is not favorable, is complete even while the income that you expected wasn't forthcoming. If we can return home, then a smile comes to your face and you remember, oh, here I am. Like, here I am, meaning when I'm not engaged in a thinking about how life should be, then actually I am. And that recognition that I am, which is what I'm really talking about, is a recognition of the core essence of the human being, that is beingness, that is aliveness and consciousness. It's resting in that where we get self-confirmation that everything is okay, except when the thinking says it's not. And if our thinking has an expectation about how life should turn out, we're going to have a commentary that says life is not okay when it doesn't turn out according to the expectation. If the expectations fall away, then when life turns out, however it turns out, there's no benchmark that we're comparing it to. So there's a saying that is very appropriate with this change of attitude. It says, happiness is not getting what you want, but wanting what you get. And the wanting is not an active wanting where you say, oh, please give me some pain. Please give me some pleasure. It's referring to, it's not getting what you want, which is usually I want, some financial success, or I want a relationship success, or I want this or that, or when this happens in life, then everything will be okay. That's happiness through outcomes. Okay? And so the saying says, happiness is not to be found in outcomes. Happiness is not to be found in getting what you want, but rather happiness is to be found in wanting what you get. And the wanting what you get is the attitude that understands that life is going to turn out one way in each moment. And if we have that attitude, then that is the attitude of acceptance. It is the attitude devoid of resistance and non-acceptance. And that is what is being referred to as wanting what you get, which simply means not resisting what is. Not resisting what is attitudinally, with the attitude that my happiness is to be found in circumstance, and therefore I want circumstance to be pleasure, 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 and not pain. And without resisting on the attitude, with the attitude of doership, where it says, I should have done this, you should have done that. The guilt and the blame. So the absence of the attitude of doership, which we could call the attitude of non-doership, but it's really just the non-arising of the attitude of doership, and the absence of the attitude that says my happiness is to be found in outcomes, and I want life to turn out pleasure, 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 which is expectation. The absence of all that is the wanting what you get. Knowing that that too shall pass, either pleasure or pain. Simultaneously, with the space available for you to return home at any moment, essentially diving deeper below the surface where the pleasure and pain is happening, and whenever necessary, dropping into the depth of who we are, where the waves on the surface simply don't touch. So I said I would talk about contracts, and the normal attitude towards signing a contract between you and another person is that we, as two ordainers, have agreed as to how the future is going to be. And so our attitude is, this is what the contract says. And then if the other person doesn't fulfill their part of the contract, our attitude of doership, the attitude of expectation, says, Why did you not fulfill the contract? Why did you, as the ordainer, not do what you said you were going to do? Thinking that the agreement that we made 3 months earlier was somehow powerful enough to overrule what life had in mind. So if our attitude towards life changes, we realize, yes, it was destined for us to sign a contract, but what unfolds is independent of the contract, or independent of what the contract says is meant to happen. What is really meant to happen is God's will. And so attitudinally, if this understanding sits in deeply, it's like, yes, we signed a contract that says you would deliver this in 3 months. And what actually happened is that in 3 months, the person didn't do that. You might be significantly financially disadvantaged or inconvenienced in some other way. And there are two attitudes that could kick in. One is, my happiness is to be found in outcomes, and I am the doer and the other is the doer, so I hate the other for not delivering the outcome, he said. And I feel that my completeness is now affected because what I need to be complete has not been delivered. That's one attitude. The other attitude is, it's understood that what happens in 3 months' time down the track from the contract being signed is God's will, just like the contract being signed was God's will. And I understand that pleasure is pleasure, pain is pain, and definitely they are not the same. On the level of circumstance, pleasure is much more pleasurable. On the level of happiness, pleasure and pain is not what determines my happiness when the false sense of self, which is a whole lot of deeply ingrained beliefs that we don't see as beliefs, that manifest as feelings and experiences about myself, when that falls away, then we find that my happiness isn't dependent on pleasure or pain. Which doesn't mean I don't care whether I get pleasure or pain. On a biological level, I do care. On a biological level, I would prefer pleasure. But I understand that life is going to deliver exactly the amount of pleasure I'm destined, exactly the amount of pain I'm destined, that the flow of life is inevitably going to be a mix, sometimes pleasure, sometimes pain. If that's deeply understood, which unfortunately it tends not to be according to how humans develop, because our psychology says my happiness, my completeness is dependent on pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. And so we sort of overlook the very nature of life, thinking that I can affect life in a way that will one day make it all pleasurable. Because we think we're the ordainers. Because we think we're God. And if that falls away, then knowing that life is sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain means that our startled response to pleasure diminishes. Our startled response to pain, what I mean by startled response is our resistance to pain, where we kick in and go, this shouldn't be like that, diminishes. Because when pain happens, if a glass falls and breaks on the floor, deep down we understand that's very much part of what happens in life. So just to throw it in the mix, I won't go into much detail because we'll take some questions now, so you can raise your hands if you've got any questions. Is that God's will, everything has happened in an instant. The whole of the unfolding of life is happening according to consciousness or source. what that's suggesting is that life is not really fundamentally a life experience of, well, I'll take away the word life experience. It's suggesting that life is not fundamentally time and space bound. It's suggesting that life is not really a physical, objective reality. Because if it was a physical, objective reality, and we run with the notion of God's will, then we have a God that is controlling physical objects, as well as thought objects and emotional arising, so which we can call emotional objects, thought objects. And that doesn't make so much sense. I mean, if someone takes it literally, that's how they might interpret everything as happening according to God's will, that God, this entity outside, is controlling the movement of everything physical. What is described when we can hear it is that life is an experience arising in consciousness, and that life is not as it appears, that the world is not as objective as it appears to be, that time and space are not as objective as they appear to be, that the whole manifestation, the framework of the life experience that we know is much more subjective than objective. What subjective means arising within a subject, arising within consciousness. That means that consciousness can imagine or dream into existence a universe based on any framework, based on any parameters that it chooses. Its imagination is the limitation. Or there is no limitation except for its imagination. That is somewhat similar to, if we use the analogy of daydreaming, that a person can daydream a world dictated by their imagination, and can have an experience of that world according to their imagination. Now, the human dreaming capacity of daydreaming, we might say, is not very convincing. But then you can look at your night dreams, and everyone has had the experience of a night dream that is very convincing, where objects in the night dream appear to arise within an objective world of time and space. Objects, including other people, physical objects, appear to be made of very objective matter. There are experiences of pleasure and pain and emotions in the dream that all feel to be objectively real. And in an instant, when the dream is over, when the person wakes up or a new dream takes its place, that world, that dream world that was created in consciousness, dissolved and was replaced by something else, which means the objects, the feelings, the thoughts were not at all what they appeared to be. And the spiritual traditions that talk about life as an illusion, talk about life as a happening, a creation in the mind of God, in the universal mind, is suggesting that all of life is not quite as it seems, is not an objective reality, but rather an appearance, an experience arising within consciousness. And what we really are is the consciousness, that all there really is the consciousness, that the fundamental truth beneath the illusion is consciousness. And so how that interplays with what I started talking about is that everything that happens in each moment is a happening according to God's will, is predetermined, means that the dream of life in the mind of God is what is happening, is what is being experienced. And it's being experienced not by the body as it appears, but rather by that which is fundamentally real, which is the consciousness in which the dream appears, the consciousness of Source. And that is how we can know our connection to Source, know ourselves as consciousness, because that is the fundamental nature of the life experience. And for as long as our attitude is an attitude that says, life is as it seems, life is an objective reality, I am a human being that is in control, then there is a huge gap between what is described in the traditional teachings of non-duality and the attitude we have towards life. And as that attitude gets smaller and smaller, as the thinking on a moment-to-moment basis starts adjusting to start to appreciate everything as a happening and not my doing, thinks about the fundamental essence of life, if in fact life is a subject of arising in consciousness, and concludes then what I must be, what is real, is the consciousness of Source in which it's all happening. And it may dawn on us that the experience of life that we know only exists because there is consciousness right now aware of the dream of life as it appears moment after moment after moment. That shift can be a significant part of the journey, because it can reveal certain aspects of the life experience that when life is seen from a certain perspective, the perspective of the physical body-mind organism, a perspective and an appreciation of the ever-present consciousness, the formless awareness that is the core of life, goes unrecognized, unrealized. And a realization of that essence that is much less changing than all of the comings and goings of the manifestation, all of the comings and goings of experience and circumstance, and the content of the dream. When that which is less changing than the content of the dream is recognized, then that's when we find ourselves more grounded, more able to rest in the depth of our being, more able to appreciate experientially that circumstance doesn't affect what I really am. And if this isn't immediately apparent, it's okay. It's not something that is necessarily going to be immediately apparent. But the more that we are interested in really looking at at what is here now, the life experience, which means thinking, but also thinking in a way that doesn't keep us disconnected from what I'm speaking about, which is the current moment experience that I am referring to as the experience created in consciousness, in the mind of God, as a predetermined story to be exactly like this. So we could say that the story of life is a story of time and space, a story of objective reality, which means that is how it has been designed to be experienced. It is a story of forgetting ourselves. It is a story of identifying ourselves as an object. feeling lost, obviously, having identified as something we're not, suffering and feeling uncomfortable because we have essentially forgotten our true nature. So it is a story of suffering, and at some point it is a story of remembering, of realizing the essence of who we are, and suffering coming to an end. And if that happens like that, it is your destiny, and it is unfolding at exactly the pace and in exactly the way it's destined to unfold according to God's will, and not a single atom is out of place. Not a single feeling, not a single thought is out of place. Even your attitude to life is part of the predetermined story of life. So there's a few hands up. I'll take some questions. Hi, Isabel.
Hello, Roger.
Hello.
I was realizing the other day it's 1 year, little more than that you began those satsangs.
Yes,
And
that's
so
right.
it was. I see your sangha is growing. It's nice.
Oh, really? Okay. I
I have
haven't.
this feeling. Maybe it's because you are always here, so maybe I have this feeling. If not, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
So I have. Maybe two questions. The other day I had an ayahuasca ceremony,
Mm-hmm.
and I was asking about how could I feel my heart more open, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then the answer was practice metta more often.
Mm-hmm.
So my first question is about what's happening when during those ceremony, when you have the conscious of being more conscious than normally, I would say,
Mm-hmm.
and this voice that says you something which is, for my experience, always very accurate, very. So that would be my first question. Where does it come from? And then the other question is, I was questioning the question about metta. I practice meditation a lot, which I really enjoy that, and leads me in a way I like very much, lots of peace and things like that. And then metta meditation, I was wondering if you pray for other, what's the meaning if all is predetermined?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That would be my two questions.
Yeah, there aren't any absolute answers to those questions. Like, where is the information coming from in those ceremonies, for example? It could be explained as you talking to yourself, a deeper part of yourself being able to communicate with the more conscious part of yourself, as in the part we are more familiar with, the conscious thinking, and that the deeper part of ourself communicates in a way that makes it seem like it is not ourself, but that the information is coming from outside. Now, so it feels like the information is information we don't have often when we have these insights. It feels like that can't be me, can't be my information, that definitely came from outside. so we have to be careful not to mix up how things feel and then conclude, well, that's how they are, because there could be a functioning of our system, the body-mind organism system, that is quite foreign to us in a way, and yet it's still functioning, and at times it delivers information to us, and because we're not familiar with it, and not familiar that there is a part of ourself working very unconsciously and very intelligently and wisely, that when those moments come, it feels like it is not anything to do with my system, because we're simply not familiar with the part of our system that is delivering that information. That could be very much an explanation for a lot of insights and things that happen on the spiritual journey, that we say it's not my doing because it's just a new functioning that hasn't been what we're familiar with. Now, it might not be what I'm saying, and it could be that the information is coming from outside, and it is our destiny in that moment for that information to be delivered to us like, wisdom via courier, and it just comes in, and it's like, there you go, this is your destiny as part of your spiritual seeking, is for you to be guided by source, through spirits, through angels, through entities, through downloads from other dimensions. That's what it that's what it feels like when we don't have more practical explanations, such as this could be a very deep part of your own intelligence working. When we don't have those explanations, then we create explanations that are much more like it feels in that moment. As these other explanations get developed, then my experience is the same things continue to happen, but we have a different attitude to what they actually are. Now, I'm not saying that it is the way that I've just said, the more practical explanation, but I'm saying let's not leave that out as a possible explanation for what is happening. So I said there's no absolute answers, because I don't know really where that information comes from. I do suspect that our system is much more intelligent than we give it credit for.
I have the feeling it comes from, not from outside. I have the deep feeling it comes from inside of me.
Yes.
It's the way it's suggested and the way it's like always right.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. That's the feeling I have. Like if I was, it come from so deep, I couldn't see it before. Mm-hmm. It was, it was offered to me. I don't know. But it comes really from something deep, and then I sometimes I just wonder, why isn't it like that more often, and why is that this experience possible if I don't take ayahuasca, for example, or because I was very I was not out of my mind when I was doing that, and even during the ceremony, it was not like I was out or dreaming, or I was very, very. I had conscience of what was happening, mm-hmm. and then I was wondering, why isn't that more often? Just when it's like a key, so it opens something. Mm-hmm. Why only this key? I don't know.
It's what's destined, right?
Oh.
According to everything happens according to destiny. It happens as destined. You're not in control, so when it happens, you can appreciate it, but then not say, why doesn't it happen more often? Because that could easily be an expectation or a desire for it to happen more often. You know, the fact is you're taking something that is on from one perspective. You could say it's something you're putting into your system. It has psychedelic properties and it's altering the brain chemistry, which can include, just like when we take alcohol, or they're not saying they're the same thing because the experience and the effects are very different, but it can enhance certain capacities. It can maybe shut down certain functions that are inhibitive, certain functions that create blocks between the deeper part of ourself. And so another explanation of why these things happen when you take ayahuasca is that the ayahuasca is having an effect on your brain and is allowing a communication from different parts of your system to happen that normally can't happen. Someone else will say, ayahuasca is not a drug. It's not affecting your brain as the way you think. It's a plant medicine. It's a spirit. And so then from that point of view, the explanation is you've gone into a sacred space. You have entered, allowed the plant spirit to come in and to guide you and to give you information. And so it happens in that situation because you are in direct contact with that wisdom that is delivering the information in that ceremony. And then outside of the ceremony, there isn't a connection to that same plant spirit in the same way. However, we can say that as our journey develops, the blocks start to fall away, and then we do have, let's say, availability, connection all the time, but the insights are not needed. So we don't have those big insights, but we just realize that we're living life free of suffering. And if that's the case, who cares about insights? The insights are particularly useful when we need them, which is in order for suffering to get cut off.
Okay. And it's like since I met you, as I told you, I tell you from time to time, I'm not suffering. I don't have this feeling. I'm more seeking than suffering, I would say. So they are just experiences, and sometimes what I learn from that is very, very strong and puts me in a direction sometimes I may forget.
Yeah.
And so
Go on.
So to go to the other question that was about the prayer, and that leads to your talks. If things are predetermined, what is the use of practicing metta meditation, and what about praying? If you understand, of course, what I mean.
Yeah. If you see, because if you take it from that angle, you say, well, it's predetermined, so whether I pray or not, what's going to happen is going to happen. If you spin it round and say, if everything is predetermined, then if praying happens, that is what is predetermined, and the outcome is also predetermined. So on that basis, if you have a thought that says prayer meditation is pointless, that thought is predetermined. It may lead to or seem to be part of a process that leads to less prayer meditation. And if that happens, it was predetermined. But you might have the thought that prayer meditation is pointless and then still find yourself doing prayer meditation, all because it's predetermined. So it's nice to see yourself. One of the reasons it's suggested is that praying for others is a way of shifting the focus from being very self-focused, very much about what I need in order to be happy, and extending it so that we become more compassionate, you could say,
Yes.
towards the other. It becomes a way of interrupting our attitude of resentment, right? Because resentment is blame and hatred towards some others. And so if we start praying for others, we're not necessarily praying for the ones we hate, although that becomes part of the practice. Pray for the people you don't like.
Yes.
And it then starts interfering with the habit of resentment and blame and hatred that is so ingrained in us because of the attitude of doership and attachment. And so prayer meditation, without us necessarily realizing it, is a way of practicing an alternative attitude. In terms of this particular teaching, which doesn't suggest prayer meditation, but doesn't think that prayer meditation is inappropriate, but what this teaching would say about prayer meditation is that if it happens, then it is a happening according to God's will. And any outcome that happens for the person that you happen to be praying for is also a happening according to God's will. And whether the two are linked, we don't know. But generally, what I'm saying is the general attitude is whatever happens, if prayer happens, it's God's will. The outcome that happens for the other person, also God's will. And maybe my prayer is destined to be a contributing factor to the outcome because it's all part of God's will.
Okay. Thank you, Roger.
You're welcome. Hi, Jaroslaw.
Hello. Can I put my video on?
Sure.
Okay, so the co-host must let me able video, Roger. So
Yeah.
you need to talk to your friend.
Yeah, it's under control. You should be okay. Try
Okay.
it.
Yeah, I'm glad to talk to you. Do you remember me?
Yes, of course.
Okay. So I'm glad. So I must say that I'm not in like maybe math in your satsang like Saturday by Saturday.
Mm-hmm.
I have my own stuff, what I need to like feel to do. So, but now I'm grateful that I can talk to you and that you have, as usual, great satsangs, great talk. I can say that you are, as me, talk active. You like to go to the detail. It's very, very, very good.
Thank you.
But I must say that I'm not so devotion. I'm a big fan of you, but I'm not so devotion like some of the attenders. You know, there is some men who always very warmly give hearts to you. So we know it's enough for now to no, yeah, okay. So yeah. So my question today for you, Roger, is like, so maybe first of all, can we like adjust for a minute, like to step together and like for in the silent, like for the 1 minute, maybe to calm myself?
Sure, why not?
Thank you, thank you. Yeah, so it's enough for me because this is the talk part, so you can just sit together. It's not proper for this, I think. So my question is about anger. You said that, and I know the Ramesh, the big teacher of you, always said that, Roger, the anger is the biological reaction, and you don't need to how to say in English, connect in the psychological aspect of anger. Is you can see this like biological, like reaction, biological reaction.
Mm-hmm.
But I have some deeper question about this because you can meet in this today world some non-dual teacher. For example, Jim Newman, and he's very much Advaita. So when somebody talk with him, and he's like the I'm looking for proper English word. He's like he showed freely his anger at the moment, and he said that this is like at this moment. So he don't like. For me, from my side, it's like maybe not so responsible from him, like a human, to show these emotions such freely and said it just happened and that's it. So I want just to share with you with this, and can you tell me, Roger? So in your way, like, do you as person like freely show anger when arise, or how it's in your side? Please tell me.
Yes, you see, the thing is, what if it's true? What if that statement is true or accurate? The statement that he makes, that it is just a happening. So what that statement is saying is not necessarily what some people would like to hear, right? Because the fact that anger just happens doesn't mean that anger isn't painful to someone. So someone who receives anger is going to feel pain because, frankly, anger is not as pleasurable as someone being nice, for example. So if we are pained by the anger, when someone says, look, they might say, I'm sorry, I don't have the intention to hurt you, but it just happened. Right? That, from their point of view, or even as I see it, is an accurate assessment of things. They're not saying that the anger is great. It's saying, sure, if I could not get angry it would be better for me as well, because when anger arises, it is pain for the person feeling angry as well, compared to feeling laughter, for example, which is more pleasurable. So if you look at the statement as a description and don't read into it more than the description is, then we might say, okay, it's an accurate description. If someone uses it as an excuse and doesn't acknowledge, for example, that yes, anger, when it happens, does deliver pain to the other. However, we shouldn't then think that if I deliver pain to the other, I am preventing them from being whole. Because if we do think that, then we will feel, we'll have to feel guilt for getting angry. And so understanding that our essence or our happiness isn't to be found in pleasure or pain means that if I deliver anger to the other through my actions or through my behavior, I understand that, yes, that is pain, not pleasure. I also understand that that is not delivering their unhappiness to them. That is just delivering pain. And I understand that I didn't want to deliver pain to them. It wasn't my intention to get angry. It just happened. And so I, think that people can address, even with understanding, they can address anger in different ways. Someone can say, I got angry, just deal with it. That could be one way. Another way is to say, look, actually, I'm really sorry that I got angry and it hurt you. I didn't intend to hurt you, and I will do my best in the future to not get angry. But if I do get angry again, understand it's the same principle. I would love not to get angry because I don't want to hurt you. But that person's understanding is, life happens and anger is part of life and I'm not in control.
Okay. But do you agree with me that usually children are afraid the angry adults, and even they sometimes cry when they meet anger is too much for them, and so in this development humanistic point of view, if somebody choose not to anger and communicate the same things in calm way, for you, in your opinion, is better or no?
It's better if someone doesn't learn from anger or doesn't gain from anger but gains from calm, then we can say it is better. But better doesn't mean I think someone else should function that way, because my attitude is, even though we can see that calm might deliver a better outcome, my attitude doesn't say, therefore the other person has to be calm, because that sort of is saying that they are the doer and they can choose whether to be calm or to be angry, and the fact is that you can't. What might happen is you appreciate, you think about it and you say, actually, I don't want to scare my child, for example. I see that it doesn't give a good outcome. Let me try, because I have thought about it, in times when the anger comes up, to take 3 deep breaths or something and to be calm. That thought might arise, and then it might actually change the person's genes, and up-to-date conditioning might change, but it may not, even if they have the intention to. That to me is the unfolding of life. Now, the fact is that some teachers that don't act gently can be great teachers as in their anger can be a great gift to someone in the Sangha, because the anger can stir someone up so much. It can trigger fear and then trigger blame towards the teacher in such a way that it becomes obvious to the person themselves, this is my suffering. And it becomes obvious there is a strong attachment to pleasure in the form of the absence of the pain of anger. And that because the teacher delivered pain, my attitude is, you hurt me, I hate you. And when that happens, especially in a teaching, we can find ourselves consumed by that thinking for days. Like, it won't leave us alone, and the hatred can get stronger and stronger. The judgment that we might have as to, the teacher should be different can be very intense, because it's not just any person, but someone that we have sort of put up on a pedestal. And in fact, not only because we've put them on a pedestal, but because the relationship with a teacher can be very profound. And so our expectation is that maybe they don't deliver us anger, and then they did. And so then the resentment is very strong, and that can be very, very beneficial for us, because we can see something from that intense suffering that arises.
Yeah. Thank you, Roger, for a bigger perspective on anger. There was some saying in I think from Buddha that you won't be punished by your anger. You will be punished for the anger. You will be punished by your anger. Mm-hmm. Something like that. So do you suggest that the best what we can offer in this understanding, that be compassionate to others, for and knowing that they do the best they can at this moment?
Yeah, so what it means is you won't be punished for your anger, but punished by your anger. Firstly, we need to be clear on the way words are how they are meant to be used in that saying. So, because if we take the word punish and treat it literally, it feels like it is a punishment for something, right? Like a punishment for getting angry. And the first part is you won't get punished for being angry. You will be punished by your anger, which really means it isn't a punishment, it is just a consequence. Meaning that when someone is angry, it's not nice for them. It's definitely not nice for the person they are angry to. But after the anger arises, and while the anger arises, the person is in a less pleasant state than if the anger wasn't there. So if we can find ourselves not affected by the anger in a way where the pain of the anger doesn't create suffering for us, and it just creates pain, but not turned into suffering. And to the extent it doesn't get turned into suffering, the pain of anger can be brushed off instantaneously, right? When that starts happening, then the other person's anger has much less of an effect on us, and that's when we can feel compassionate for the person who is angry, because we realize that is their genes and up-to-date conditioning, not in their control, and that is their burden in life in a way. To have that particular makeup. Now, let me also make it clear is that in the case of a teacher with understanding, when they get angry, it's not much of a burden in life. They still have the burden of it being painful, not pleasurable, but their involvement in it, where it turns into shame and regret, is very diminished. And that is what you are describing when it was described that way, is the attitude that says, look, anger arose, but I'm not going to get involved in it. And in the integrated way, when the understanding is integrated, which is not just in certain teachings, it gets delivered a certain way. It doesn't mean the understanding isn't integrated. But, you know, it is very possible to really say sorry, even when you understand that it is God's will unfolding, that the anger is God's will.
Sorry that interrupt you, but you see, you are just this beautiful, nice gentleman that you when you see that somebody talks to you, look, your behavior, like do something like painful for me, as you not one time you said, I'm like sure that you said to this person, look, I'm sorry that you feel this way, I'm not like meant to do this, and you like honor the feeling, and I am like also sure that, like, for example, Jun Newman don't say like sorry to this person who like talk to him that it's painful for them. He said, it's your problem, I think it will be like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so
what do you think?
I think that there is wisdom in that. And it can be very powerful to leave someone with that rather than to placate and weaken the response, because it will lead to something, or it could lead to something very significant. And it's just a difference in personality, maybe a difference in the practical integration, where, you know, maybe the person's thinking hasn't said, actually, why not say sorry? If it's just a happening, the anger is a happening and my apology is a happening. And if their thinking hasn't gone that way, then they may not spontaneously come up with an apology. And so it's just life unfolding. And hopefully, if it was you that he got angry with, for example, the more you can rest with anger from the other is just pain. It's the internal reaction to the pain that is the suffering. That means that your attention, instead of being, he shouldn't be like that, switches around and say, let me look at what is happening when anger is delivered. And what is probably happening is that a wound, a part of the identity that is fragile to that pain, is being triggered. And the opportunity is to now recognize that and shift the response from blame to a recognition that the suffering is happening on this side of the fence, on the attitudinal side of the fence, not because of not because of the pain.
Yeah, but I'll be honest, I have some traumas from the child. I had I had aggressive father, so I am like extra sensitive for this all anger, violent stuff, and I don't like when people like do these tools in life, and I like want to guard my child and don't want to like put him in this environment. I think this is like honest and just, yeah. What do you think, Roger?
Yes, there is. You have that capacity to choose, right? So when you find a teaching, if it doesn't resonate, that's the beauty of having many different options, different people with different personalities, different approaches. So it then is up to you to say, okay, so that's how that person is, and I choose to listen to someone else that has a different delivery method. And hopefully then you can make that choice, understanding that they're just different and that you resonate with one of the two and not both of the two. And someone else really resonates with that direct approach. And in fact, the fact that you choose a different teaching because you resonate with a different teaching may ultimately not be that good for you, because maybe being in that other environment would be more transformative, but we don't know. It might be more traumatic and not be transformative. It might be just traumatic. So because we don't know what is best for us, because what is best for us is essentially an outcome, and we're not in control of the outcome, we don't know what's going to happen in the future, I suggest that in each moment we do what we feel like, what we think or feel to do, which is the thing we can keep doing that consistently. I'm just going to make choices based on what I feel is best, knowing that the outcome is not in my control. And so that means you can live life and you can choose if you feel like listening to A and not B. That's what I would suggest you choose. And your attitude can be that choice is God's will and the outcome is God's will.
Yes, you always says that everything what's happened now is like DNA, like genetic, and up to date condition.
Mm-hmm.
And what about this, like, for naturalistic? And I agree with you. But what about grace? Like grace, like this. The grace is a part of this?
Yeah, grace is the new conditioning that comes in, that is delivered by life, that changes the up-to-date conditioning. So the new conditioning that changes us is not in not our doing, and so when it changes us for the better or in a way that is amazing, we can say that is thanks to grace.
Okay. But I'm curious. Curious is like this curious English. So connectivity to. I'm just curious about your connectivity, like to God. Because do you have in your life, like maybe as a child or as a like partner, this like sincere, like very tender, in humility, like from the humanistic side, that you're like just such in wonder, in appreciation of all of this, and even like they cry. Do you have a moment in your life when you was crying and just appreciate that you live, you are? Do you have such like tender moments in your like heart feelings, or you are just in logic, like?
To me, the two are not necessarily different. It might seem like it on the outside, but to me, logic is creativity as I feel it, and it's not separate from flow and connection to source. I think a lot of people look at how their experience of logic is,